And we're not capacitated by the number of people on Earth when it comes to AI, right? The number of smartphones is kind of driven by the number of people walking around. AI, industrial automation is not capped by that. And as we get autonomous factories and autonomous cars, there's just more and more application space for high-performance electronics, which is great for our company.
30 seconds. Who do you compete with?
We've got great competitors, but diverse competitors. We're the only company in our market that can speak to the breadth of electronics applications that we have in our portfolio. So we compete a bit with DuPont. We compete with a company called Atotech that's part of MKS Group. We've got local competitors in markets like Japan and China. It's a competitive market, but our ability to provide value to customers through materials compatibility and a broad product offering is unrivaled.
See, I was trying to figure out how he got to where he is. Now I figured it out.
And?
Investment banking to private equity. Then he says, screw this. I'm going to go and do it myself. And he went to like a real industry and get a real job that makes stuff. I've seen that route before. A lot of successful
Real industries
folks
that
have
make
done
stuff is really fun.
Yeah,
that's
you
really
figure,
cool.
like, I'm not just going to bank these people. I'm going to go do it. Ben Glicklich, CEO of Element Solutions. Appreciate you coming in here into our studio. It's a fascinating company. Never would have thought about it. I learned something new today. Element Solutions. You need all the chemical stuff for the tech and the chips and all that kind of stuff.
Things.
And there are people that do that for a living. That's good stuff. We appreciate it. S&P 500 off 0.5%. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Stocks retreating from Friday's all-time highs. Yields also surging as we get a raft of earnings as well. America's service sector expanding at the fastest pace in 4 months in January, so that rebounded from a lackluster showing at the end of last year. However, a gauge of the cost of materials, that flashed a warning as war in the Mideast affects shipping costs. And then you have the earnings picture. Here's the scorecard. 238 companies in the S&P 500 have reported so far this season. 59% delivered positive earnings growth. About 60% delivered positive sales growth. And Bloomberg Intelligence, this is Gina Martin Adams and Wendy Song, they write on the Bloomberg today that the S&P 500 is on track to crush fourth quarter earnings per share estimates. Right now, the S&P 500, 28 points lower. That's down 0.6%. We're at 49.29 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, 379 points lower, down about 1%. The NASDAQ 100, 114 points lower, and that's down 0.7%. The two-year yield, that is 10 basis points higher after that data at 4.47. 10-year, that's up 14 basis points. That's at 4.16 right now. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Alex and Paul.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Alex Steele, Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, streaming live on YouTube. So you can just head over to youtube.com, search Bloomberg Radio. Estee Lauder. The stock's up 13% today. That's the short-term pop on, I guess, some cost cuts. We'll get to that with our next guest. Down 42% on a trailing 12-month basis. That's the longer-term story I want to dig into as well. And we can do it all with one Deborah Aiken. She is the senior luxury analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. She joins us from London via Zoom. You want to talk luxury? You want to talk high street shopping? You talk to Deb Aiken. So, Deb, let's start with Estee Lauder today. Good day for the company. The stock's up 13% today. What's driving the stock today?
Absolutely. It's all about, well, let's say having really impacted negatively with several earnings downgrades and misses over the last 6-7 quarters. The company positively surprised. It met its organic sales decline of 8%, not a growth, and its EPS came in slightly better, so down 20%. But the big thing is the restructure program. So it already has a restructure program in play. That didn't seem to be deep enough, wide enough, and have enough detail to it. And now they've raised 500 to 700 million of cost on a deeper restructure program to bring up to 1.4 billion through 25 and 26, mostly 25 or majority 25 weighted, so with the expectation. So that's kind of like 400 million extra on what they were expecting before, Deb, in terms of operating profitability.
What was the problem that they had to fix by doing that? Like, why is it so hard to be Estee Lauder? I thought everyone would pay $1 million for perfect skin, not talking my book or anything.
Right, the big thing over the last couple of years that we've seen, we've always known that Estee Lauder, a very premium product, and it did so well for so many years, but it had very high exposure in Asia. So we ended up a couple of years ago with a stuffed retail, duty-free travel retail area across China and some parts of Asia, which were exacerbated by South Korea also, and the issues there with the Daegu shopper. And what we found, and we'd always been saying, you know, their supply side, the way that they organize themselves, the logistics, they didn't have the hubs in place in Asia to do as much as they were doing. So they were caught short or caught overstuffed. So they had far too much in trade, and that has taken a long time to temper down and start to normalize, and we should return overall to growth this next quarter.
And Deb, let's stay with the China story, because I know from talking to you over the years and reading your research, the China consumer is just critical for luxury shopping. Can you give us a sense? Because I don't, when I walk down Madison Avenue or Fifth Avenue, I see all the European tourists back. They're back in, you know, in size. Not so much with the Chinese. What's going on there?
The big thing, very late in getting visas through, the reopening of, as we thought from the beginning of last year, reopening of travel, but the view is that travel internationally won't come back until the second half of the year. And we are starting to hear some of those luxury companies saying we're seeing more Chinese, more Asian customers in our stores. Back home, there's a lot more spending, flights are fuller. The surveys that we're doing are saying that they will travel, but a lot of that travel so far has been across Asia.
But what's interesting is that not all are created equal. I feel like you can cherry pick a couple of luxury stocks that have been somewhat immune. And I'm just wondering what those are. And I still like, and in the skincare world too, like what is that immune skincare high-end product that doesn't matter? We're all buying it anyway.
I think that, there's some huge numbers in terms of some of the brands within the Estée Lauder portfolio doing extremely well. Lots of the brands up double digit, but it's that trade that draws down. When you look at the Europe number for Estée Lauder, that's where they stock travel retail. That's where it sits in its P&L, and it's down minus 14. But actually, Europe underlying is flat, and it's the same for the North American market. Within that, there are brands like The Ordinary and La Mer, and several of the higher end brands doing very, very well, up double digit. And it's the same across. If I think about the way that actually luxury, and L'Oreal aside, L'Oreal is doing phenomenally well with a high base of its product in what it classes as L'Oreal Luxe. But let's go to some of the luxury companies and the way that LVMH and others are building sizable scale in perfume and cosmetics. That's for growth of 6 to 8% per year and very strong margin. So there are a lot of brands out there doing very, very well. But in particular, what has happened is, and stock picking, cherry picking, it's about the brands who've had the portfolio that hasn't had so much Asia travel retail, or where it's really been able to manage that. Because even if I think about LVMH, within its selective retailing, it housed DFS, duty-free stores, and Sephora. And at one point last year, they were both down, and they've now fully recovered. We're starting to see for the US some robust numbers coming through, even from that aspirational end, across luxury, across brands. It's getting a little better, but it's going to take time.
And that's John Tucker with the aspirational spending.
Do you invest in your face?
Other than maximum
What does
strength,
that mean?
Can't you tell?
I shave.
No.
Maximum
I invest
strength,
in my face.
Maximum strength, sunblock is basically the only thing for this Irish American.
Okay, but that's a really good thing.
Yep.
I mean, you're doing something.
Sure.
I was just thinking that the only thing that I will not buy on sale is my skincare. Because it never goes on sale. If you find something that works for you, you're
stick with it.
A certain aged woman who does media and on TV. Like,
Oh,
I will
please.
pay for it. I'm not wrong, Deb, right?
The other thing that you do is you actually, without realizing, you trade up. And right now at the moment, there are some youngsters who are under 20 who are already moving into anti-age, and the market is trying to stop that.
True.
So as you get older, you're trading up. My story, which I think I relayed to Paul a while back, was late in the autumn. I was in England, in Cambridge, and there were 3 Chinese consumers who couldn't get product from La Prairie, very high-end skincare product, which is under the house of Beiersdorf, its biggest brand being Nivea. And they were there spending over £3,000 on a little gift package of La Prairie, very high-end eye product. That was way out of my price range. And
Paul's like, what are these names? Are these real companies? What is this?
I just use Irish Spring and a washcloth. That does it for me.
We can tell.
Unbelievable. Hurts my soul. Invest in your face. This is the strong takeaway from that.
Hey, Deb, how are the luxury stocks? What's kind of the luxury call here? I look at the FA function for Estée Lauder, and it looks like for the fiscal 2025, the June of 25 year, the street's looking for a big pickup in revenue and profitability for Estée Lauder. What's behind that?
That's all about that inventory. And to put that inventory in Asia into context, it's dragged down skincare in this quarter, organic sales minus 10%. It's dragged down Europe to minus 14, where underlying Europe was flat because it stores that travel retail. So it's about that inventory normalizing, and they're saying that has happened right now at the end of 2Q. So we head into 3Q with normalized level, and so therefore, if that is the case and it's better managed, we should start to see double-digit growth coming from there. And if we were looking underlying without that area, then we saw mid-single digit growth. So that's what that's about. And then also on top of this new restructuring program, and with some of those benefits to come through 25, we've been playing around on MODL on the calculator, and what we see there is around an expectation of 12 to 13% uplift to that 2025 operating profit to hopefully come through on consensus.
Hey, Deb,
Nice.
really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Deborah Aiken, Bloomberg Intelligence, Senior Industry Analyst. So it just raises the question at the end of the day, when is China wind up coming back and traveling? And
I know.
we're back to that trade, which was the trade last year at this exact same time. And do we buy it this time? Do you think it's real?
I don't know. I think so. Now they're back to, we heard from the Macau and Singapore gaming companies, the Chinese travelers are there. Okay, let's go a little bit further now, see if they can get the visas and the flights to come to Europe and to come to the U.S. Because, again, Fifth Avenue, you talk to merchants on Fifth Avenue and Madison Avenue, and they're waiting for that. They thought it would be a this year. I mean, a 23 event, it was not. So, but they're
I can just see
critical.
Paul like strolling down Fifth Avenue, like going into stores like
Well,
Anthropology, being like, "Hey, how's it going?"
I was into my mega store getting some work done on my watch, and I did ask that question, and I typed to Deb Aiken right away. Say, here's some feedback from the store on Fifth Avenue, starting to come back a little bit over the last 3 or 4 months. So, but
interesting.
they're not taking over the city.
In the
and
same
some
way.
of the
Yeah.
traffic they did in some of these luxury shopping areas. All right, right now let's head down to Washington, D.C., World and National News with Amy Morris.
All right, thank you, Paul. The Senate has unveiled its long-awaited deal tying tougher immigration policies to aid for Ukraine. House Speaker Mike Johnson has called the bill dead on arrival even before the text was released. Terry Haynes is founder of Pangea Policy and says the bill is not dead.
What they're saying is it's dead on arrival because they prefer their own bill. The momentum here is much towards political and substantive, is much towards a strong bill. Certainly Biden wants that. Certainly Republicans want it.
Terry Haynes of Pangea Policy, a guest on Bloomberg Surveillance. The bill comes with a price tag of about $118 billion, providing aid to Israel and Ukraine and other foreign policy priorities. Roughly $20 billion would be earmarked to securing the border. The first procedural votes are set for Wednesday. Iranian-backed Houthis vowed to respond to U.S. and British-led airstrikes after dozens of targets of the Yemen-based rebel group were struck over the weekend. We talked about it with Mark Champion of Bloomberg Opinion, and we learned more about the risks that the U.S. may be drawn into a regional conflict.
For now, it's very clear that the U.S. does not want to escalate, and the Iranians know it. The Iranians also made it clear they're not in for a war. That's not what they're looking for right now. For the moment, neither of the major players wants to see this escalate, so they'll do what they can to prevent it from doing so.
The U.S. and its allies targeted Houthi sites at 13 locations in Yemen, part of an effort to end the militant group's attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea. The Supreme Court will hear arguments this week about whether former President Trump should be removed from Colorado's primary ballot. The argument to keep him off the ballot is that he violated the Constitution by committing insurrection on January 6th, 2021. They are expected to hear that case on Thursday. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg News. With this Bloomberg Business Flash, well, after Friday's record close, the major stock averages today, they're selling off. In the S&P 500, you have 10 of the 11 major industry groups lower. Biggest drag is from materials, and that's where you should find shares of Air Products. They delivered guidance that was worse than feared, and that stock right now is down, 13.8%. And the leading stock in the index right now in terms of the index points, that's Estee Lauder. That is up 14% right now. They announced a restructuring that also includes job cuts, so that's a cross-cutting move. Yields are higher, and meantime, Sally Krawcheck of Ellevest says, you know what, it's hard not to be bullish over the long term.
Well, when we do our asset allocation, we look at long-term returns that we're expecting, and they're terrific, right? The equity markets, if you go back to the early 1900s, tend to go up about 10% a year. You know, balanced portfolio 6%. It compounds.
S&P 500 right now, 28 points lower. That's down 0.6%. 4930 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average down 373 points. That's a decline of just about 1%. The NASDAQ 100, 104 points lower. That is down 0.6%. 2-year yield 9 basis points higher. That is the highest level of the year, 446 right now. The 10-year is up 14 basis points. That is at 416. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Alex and Paul.
I'm Alex Steele, along with Paul Sweeney. We are live here from the Interactive Brokers studio at our headquarters in New York. Definitely also find us on YouTube, Bloomberg YouTube/radio, something like that. That sounds like we should probably get that. A URL there. Okay. We also are looking at Bloomberg Intelligence. All our analysts covering 2,000 industries and 2,000 companies and 130 industries all across the world. Okay, so you had John Tucker talking about what's happening with the stock market and the bond market. A big reason for this is the S&P Services Index, ISM Services Index, really solid. Prices paid, really solid. Employment, higher. New orders, higher. So let's get the breakdown here on what this all means. Danielle DiMartino Booth is CEO and Chief Strategist of QI Research. Danielle, what do you make of this economy? I mean, it's really hard to see any kind of slowing. It's really hard to see sort of where that's going to come from. What's your take?
Well, I think of all of the indicators that we've seen in the last few days, the where it's going to come from part is the most apparent at this juncture. You know, one of the things that we noticed when the ISM Services report came out in December was that the employment component had dropped to 43 and change. We went, oh my gosh, that's absolutely the worst we've ever seen. Of course, this morning it rebounded back above the 50 line that separates expansion and contraction. All good and well, you say, right? Well, you look under the hood. ISM Services covers 18 industries. In November, there were 10 that had rising employment. In December, there were 7 of those 18 with rising employment in 7 sectors. In January, there were 3. And so I think we have to be very careful with the data about getting too excited about any one headline. You know, one of the things that came out on Friday in the employment report was that the headline employment had increased by 325,000. You peel the onion back a layer and you find out that since the month of February, we haven't had a single full-time job created in the United States. In fact, it's been negative 97,000 since then. So the reason I think markets are a little bit schizophrenic is because you have to keep looking left and right or you're going to get run over.
Yeah, one of the many reasons I like having Danielle on the show, because I like to just take the headline number and run with it. She doesn't do that. She doesn't allow me to do that. She says, I got to peel back layers and onions and things like that. So, Danielle, I think if I kind of read your very good social media profile, you're not in the soft landing camp, are you? What's your call here? I sense you're more cautious and you think the market should be more cautious.
Yeah, I do think the market should be more cautious. We have We have several signposts that show that October is probably when the National Bureau of Economic Research is going to go back and backdate the recession. We actually have one of their main indicators that they follow, which is income ex-government transfers adjusted for inflation. That's negative. If you look at industrial production, one of the huge arbiters of recession for the NBER, it also is negative. And in fact, we're starting to see problematic inventory build in autos. We had auto sales come in at 15.0 million seasonally adjusted annualized rate. They were expected to come in at 15.7. That was a quiet report that kind of went by the wayside last Thursday. So there are so many revisions going on. Goldman Sachs did a huge report at the end of the year that said every single month of retail sales in 2023 had been revised downwards, and that retail sales were flat on the year. I think we're having such an issue with statisticians in Washington, D.C., because so many of their seasonal analysis modeling is based off of and includes the pre-pandemic era. So by the time the dust settles, they're like, oh, wait, now that we've got everything in, or maybe we've got the smallest sample size in the history of, say, the non-farm payroll survey, once we get all of the data in hand, we were incorrect. We're going to go back and revise that down.
So I can
that's
imagine,
a lot of the issues.
Danielle, this makes your job difficult, our job difficult, and the Fed's job even more difficult. So we're now looking at a little over 4 cuts priced in for this year. What do you think is legit, particularly with all this uncertainty and revisions that you're talking about, and when would it start?
Well, had it not been for the very strong tone that Chair Jay Powell voiced on 60 Minutes last night, I would be more in the camp of saying if they do start to cut rates, they will do so at every meeting beginning in May, so May, June, July, and September. But Chair Powell seems so adamant in communicating that he will be the apolitical Fed chair. He will be nonpartisan. He will not be viewed as being political in an election year. It's a toss-up, 50-50, whether or not the Fed historically has cut rates or raised rates, taken any action in the FOMC that immediately precedes the election. That would be the September the 18th FOMC. I wouldn't be surprised to see 3 rate cuts, May, June, and July, and then a pause.
Interesting. So from your perspective, Danielle, the data you look at, which is not necessarily the data that lay people like me look at, which is basically how much does it cost to fill up my car with gas, is inflation whipped in this country or no?
You know, it's interesting you asked that question because recently, Truflation, TRU-flation, which a bunch of bond traders introduced to me, they actually gave me the raw data. We ran a quick correlation. It's got a 0.97 correlation with headline inflation, the headline CPI. 2 times ago, Truflation popped down underneath the Fed's 2% target. I said, whoa, what happened there? And it was mostly led by hotels, and it was one sector. Last week, it dropped down to 1.4. 1.4%.
Yep.
And so I reached out to the founders of Truflation. I said, what gives? What was that huge swing factor? Did I miss it? Did I fill up at the gas tank for a lot less? And they said, no, Danielle, 10 out of 12 categories had appreciably large declines, meaning the disinflation that was a one-off here or there has become extremely widespread. If you've got 10 out of your 12 major categories, more than 300 million real-time prices feed this monster model per day with, again, a 97% correlation with headline CPI. I think that Powell's bigger impediment going into the second half of 2024 might be larger rate cuts than he anticipates or would like. If inflation's coming down as quickly as it is.
All right, Danielle, thank you so much for joining us. We always appreciate getting your input. Danielle DiMartino Booth, she's the CEO and Chief Strategist at QI Research, joining us via Zoom from Big D, Dallas, Texas. She was on the Fed, Dallas Fed down there years past. So great perspective there. We appreciate chatting with her. S&P 500, it's off about 0.5%. The Dow's off about 0.9%. NASDAQ also off about 0.5%. Yields are higher. 10-year Treasury up 14 basis points. 4.16 on your 10-year Treasury. WTI crude oil off just slightly, just above $72 per barrel. More coming up. This is Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
And I'm John Tucker in the newsroom. We'll look at some of the companies we're following. Tesla shares, they're down. German newspaper reporting the German IT giant SAP, they make all that software, they're removing the electric vehicle maker from the list of its car suppliers. SAP currently has a total of it's a big fleet, 29,000 cars in its fleet, but the story doesn't specify just how many of those are Teslas. They say Tesla's price list fluctuations make planning more difficult and pose higher risk for their fleet. Coinbase Global, that also is slipping, the largest intraday drop in more than a month. Mizuho analyst writes that the Bitcoin exchange-traded funds may actually be a double whammy for the company, as it sees outflows and lower spot volumes. The hope for Coinbase this year was that the Bitcoin ETFs would actually bring more money in spot trading to the company, but Mizuho estimates outflows from ETFs that Coinbase is the custodian of have exceeded inflow by more than $1 billion. And we've been talking about Estee Lauder. They're cutting as many as 3,000 positions. This is all part of a restructuring plan to put one of the world's largest beauty companies back on track. Those shares have been jumping. In fact, in terms of index points, the leader in the S&P 500 right now. The revamp plan aimed at making the owner of the Ordinary and Clinique brands a leaner and more profitable company so it can respond more quickly to beauty trends. Yes, that is a thing, fueled by social media and invest more in its brands. Plummeting sales, in particular at duty-free shops in airports and elsewhere in Asia, have also dragged down sales and profits at Estee Lauder. And that's your company news.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, looking at these markets here, the S&P 500 off 0.5%, the Dow Jones Industrials off about 0.9%, and NASDAQ also off about 0.5%. The Russell, the small cappers taking it on the chin, off 1.8%, so they had been outperforming, but here on this down day, they are underperforming for sure. Yields higher. Let's go with the 2-year Treasury. It's up about 10 basis points, 4.46% on your 10-year Treasury. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We get World and National News with Amy Morris.
All right, thank you, Paul. The Hollywood Hills and the Santa Monica Mountains face life-threatening landslides and flash flooding as the second of back-to-back atmospheric rivers is churning slowly through California, flooding roadways and knocking out power to hundreds of thousands of people. We get the latest now. Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn.
Storm system off the coast of the western United States continues to bring significant rains. Looks like another 2 to 4 inches falls from San Diego towards Los Angeles and Anaheim today, while in the mountains to the north and east of San Diego and Los Angeles, we could see another 5 inches of precipitation in liquid form. Looks like some of the mountains in California will see anywhere from 2 to 3 feet of snow.
Bloomberg meteorologist Rob Carolyn. California Governor Gavin Newsom has declared a state of emergency now in 8 counties. Sweden's bid to join NATO remains on hold. Members of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's party boycotted a session aimed at ratifying Sweden's accession. Bloomberg News Hungary Bureau Chief Zoltán Simon.
He doesn't want to seem to be negotiating with Orban or to be blackmailed on the issue of Sweden's accession to NATO, which basically every other member thinks is crucial for the alliance to bolster its capability to defend NATO's eastern and northern borders.
Bloomberg Zoltán Simon in Budapest. Women artists were the big winners at the 66th Annual Grammy Awards last night. Miley Cyrus won her first 2 Grammys for Record of the Year and Best Pop Solo Performance. Taylor Swift took home 2 awards thanks to her Midnights album. Tracy Chapman made a rare appearance to sing her 1988 hit Fast Car with country music star Luke Combs.
I remember when you were at the time, running in your house, it's the best like I was wrong.
Luke Combs' cover of Fast Car raced to the top of the country music charts last year and was nominated for a Grammy at this year's ceremony. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. Paul and Alex.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Amy was just reporting on that storm in Southern California. Just incredible, some of the pictures you see. And, you know, when I think of California, and I owned a home out there for many, many years, it was just drought forever. But I mean, now it's like the opposite happening over there. They just can't, the ground can't take the water here.
Well, this is what's so interesting too, is that just because you need water doesn't mean you need a deluge like this.
Yes,
and that
exactly.
extreme weather events will get much more extreme, and then how you wind up managing it. And the funny thing is, if you wind up sort of addressing that and building for big floods, then the next crisis in 50 years might be something totally different that then you're not prepped for.
No, and it's interesting, you know, I know you spend a lot of time in Southern California, but I'm just amazed that they put houses.
Do I?
Do you? I'm
No.
sure you travel. Oh, so
No.
that's me. I haven't been out to Hollywood for 30 years. But I'm just amazed. It doesn't matter how steep the hill is. We're putting not just a house, a monster house there, expensive house. And I'm like, the people, boy, you're really tempting fate. It's like, you know, people, you know, building a house right on the beach, you know.
Well, let me ask you this question. We don't have a lot of time, but let me ask it anyway. Why do people still live in California?
Great weather.
But aside from that, like, taxes are high, your energy infrastructure stinks, your gasoline price is bananas, and then you have these weird mudslides, water stuff.
Here's the answer when I told my 13-year-old son. We started the day skiing in Lake Tahoe, world-class skiing conditions. We drove down and we met his brothers and sisters and the rest of the family on the beach in Carmel, California, same day. He skied Lake Tahoe and he got a sunset at Carmel Beach on the same day. Only in California can you do that. That's kind of, as I said to my son, he was 13 at the time, this is why the people risk mudslides.
This is why you
pay
$5 a gallon for gas.
And pay $5 a gallon so we can
for
have
that moment.
So you can have that experience. So I hope our good friends out in California are doing okay with this weather. Seeing some amazing video out of Santa Barbara, places like that usually are used to very nice weather. All right, Sound On with Joe Matthew. He is down in Washington, D.C. He's got all the D.C. talk. Sound On starts right now.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The border deal is out, and the U.S. launches more strikes. Welcome to the fastest show in politics with two major stories coming out of Washington today. We have both covered for you here with details on the border bill and the latest on U.S. retaliation against Iranian proxies. We'll be joined momentarily by Bloomberg national security expert Ian Marlowe, and a conversation ahead with Maya McGinnis from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Analysis from our signature panel. They're both with us. Rick Davis, Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors with insights straight ahead, all after we get a look at Wall Street. Let's bring you up to date on trading right now with Charlie Pellet in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ very much in the red to kick off the new trading week. Was a winning week last week, but right now we are looking at a loss of 22 points in the S&P 500 index, down 0.5%. The Dow lower by 363 points, drop there of 0.9%. NASDAQ down 68, decline of 0.4%. Traders are sending both stocks and bonds lower following stronger than estimated economic data and signals that the Federal Reserve is not ready to call victory over inflation just yet. The 10-year on this Monday, 4.16%, with a 2-year right now, 4.46%. Austin Goolsbee is president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. And this morning on Bloomberg Radio, our Michael McKee asked him about a March rate cut.
I never like tying our hands ahead of meetings when you got weeks of data coming through. It feels like the economy's been quite strong on the growth front. You got big jobs numbers, you got big GDP numbers, better than expected. But at the same time, we've had inflation better than expected too.
And speaking of the economy, Caterpillar shares, they're up now by 1.6% this morning. Caterpillar batted away concerns of a global economic slowdown with higher fourth quarter sales in its energy and transportation businesses, helping the global machinery maker post profit that topped analysts' expectations. Spot gold down $17 the ounce, now at 2022, a drop now of 0.8%, and crude oil up 0.3%, 72.46 a barrel. So again, recapping, stocks are lower with the S&P down 22 now, down 0.5%, 10-year yield 4.15%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That, Joe Matthew, is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Sir. We thank you, as always, Charlie Pellet in bipartisan purple. You'd know that if you were with us on YouTube. Go there now, search Bloomberg Global News. You can always find us, of course, on the radio and on the satellite. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Hope you had a great weekend. We thank you for joining here on the Monday edition of Balance of Power, as we begin today with news of a third day of strikes, number 3, against Iranian-backed militias. After the United States led strikes beginning on Friday, we were with you on Balance of Power when that news broke the end of last week. They essentially have not stopped since. The U.S. leading strikes Saturday against Houthi targets in northern Yemen. Of course, on Friday, more than 85 targets in Syria and Iraq. And that's where we start our conversation with Ian Marlowe, Bloomberg senior reporter, with us here on this Monday as the U.S. pledges continued airstrikes, but nothing directly against Iran. Ian, there's a lot I'd like to ask you about here, including Anthony Blinken's trip back into the region. But what are we hearing from national security circles here? How long might these strikes last?
Yeah, at the moment, everyone is sort of promising a sort of sustained or multi-tiered campaign of strikes across a variety of targets. They're clearly trying to send a message here to Iran, hitting their groups in Iraq and Syria and also in Yemen. They're trying to navigate this sort of tricky situation where they're trying to pushed back against this attack that killed 3 U.S. troops about a week ago in Jordan, and also responding simultaneously to sort of ongoing attacks from the Houthis in Yemen on commercial shipping, and trying to do so while not going overboard and prompting an Iranian response that sort of leads to just a sort of total spiraling out of control in the Middle East. So it's something that is a tricky thing to navigate, but the U.S. is sort of signaling now that these are going to go on for some time. And they're also saying, obviously, they're not going to telegraph anything in advance. So everyone is just sort of waiting to see how long this U.S. response goes, because it's already been much bigger than anything we've seen since October 7th, when obviously the region sort of plunged into a new war.
That is for sure. And seeing the strikes in Yemen added to Iraq and Syria over the weekend, Ian, prompting threats from Houthi rebels that they will respond. Is the U.S. expecting some sort of response here to the retaliation?
Yeah, I mean, I think they definitely are. I think they've baked that in. The Houthis from the beginning of the U.S. strikes on Yemen a couple weeks ago have been sort of pledging every single time their facilities get hit. They say, we're going to continue. We're going to keep fighting back, in the name of the Palestinians, which is what they say. I think the problem for the U.S. there is that people have said there's not so much to hit in Yemen. This is a group that withstood years of bombardment from Saudi Arabia during that war, and a lot of this stuff is sort of mobile. So over the weekend, we saw the U.S. hit sort of weapons depots, underground supplies, things that were aimed at degrading capability. And administration sources were telling Bloomberg reporters over the weekend that they're actually fairly optimistic that they are degrading the capabilities of the Houthis to launch more attacks, and also trying to stop Iran from resupplying them with some of the advanced weapons that they're sending at these commercial ships too.
That's what I wanted to ask you about, Ian, in our remaining moment here. I don't know how the Houthis have anything left after the series of attacks that we've conducted here. It's got to be approaching a dozen, including last weekend, in this sort of back and forth that we've been seeing. But to what extent is the United States concerned? If we're going to focus on Iranian-backed proxies, how concerned are we that Iran will not be resupplying these proxies for the next fight?
I think that's a perfect question. I mean, I think the U.S. is not intending to change Iran's mind totally with these strikes. What they're trying to do is to deter the sort of cadence of resupply and the strikes that these groups are able to commit. I think there's a genuine sense in the administration that they don't think Iran wants a broader war, but there's also a realization that not all of the proxy groups are equal to some degree. So while Hezbollah in Lebanon is sort of being kept on the back burner and sort of protected in case Iran wants to do something more serious with Israel, the Houthis are sort of allowed to go a little bit wilder to some degree and absorb the U.S. response. There's a general sense in the sort of community of former officials that Iran doesn't care that much about the Houthis in terms of what they can withstand from the U.S. So they're much more cautious and protective of Hezbollah because it's a sort of larger and better trained militia.
Thank you, Ian. Great reporting. Bloomberg senior reporter Ian Marlowe with us here on Balance of Power as we turn from one top story to the next. The weekend of strikes also took place alongside a deal actually being struck on the border, and the text has been released. The headline on the terminal now: senators reach deal on Ukraine aid, U.S. border, but hurdles remain. And that's for sure. You've got the Speaker of the House still calling this DOA in the House of Representatives. Even conservatives and progressives in the Senate are making us wonder if this can pass the chamber in which it was born. This is, of course, the deal that we have been talking about here for weeks, if not months. The final price tag on this. We finally have the text here after talking about this for so long. $118 billion. That is more than first estimated and more than was requested by the White House in its supplemental ask. It cuts the number of migrants eligible for asylum. It changes the way claims are processed, and everyone's finding something to hate here. That's where we start our conversation with Maya McGinnis. Always fascinating to talk to Maya with the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, where she is president. It's interesting here, Maya, to learn that we can, in fact, reach compromise on something. Whether it gets passed is another matter. But is any of this paid for?
Well, we are right now in a moment of lots of emergency or supplemental spending, which basically means nobody bothers to pay for it. And there's a good argument that when you're talking about emergencies, it's not something that needs to be offset because it's unexpected. It's a one-time thing. You jump in, you find the money later, you deal with that later. But obviously, the border is an emergency in terms of how big of a problem it is, but it is not something we haven't known about. So there's a lot of emergency spending right now on the agenda. Border, Ukraine, Israel, all sorts of different things that they are contemplating. None of these things would be offset. They would add to the national debt. And I would say that at a time when the debt is as bad as it is, even legitimate emergencies, we should try to offset those costs over a reasonable amount of time because debt is debt. And we've got to deal with the emergencies that are piling up in the world right now, but we also have to deal with the emergency of the national debt. And you do that by paying for things.
Because it is its own emergency. Maya McGinnis, debt is debt. You're right about that. Now I see Speaker Johnson, who doesn't like this bill, and says it won't even get a vote. Steve Scalise said that. He is planning a vote this week, Maya, on a $17 billion standalone Israeli aid package. Remembering he did this at one point, and there were offsets that were coming out of enhanced funding for the IRS. It appears there are none here. The Freedom Caucus is unhappy about it. So is that little honeymoon over? Now the Speaker of the House is putting bills on the floor that aren't paid for?
Well, this was a complicated one. So when they came out and said they were going to pay for the Israeli funding, that was really a great sign of understanding there are very important things we have to do. Important things are worth paying for. There's an important caveat on this one, though, which is repealing the money for the IRS doesn't actually save money. It makes the deficit larger because all of the experts who have evaluated this say that additional dollar for the IRS actually generates more than that in terms of closing the tax gap or the amount of taxes that are owed by corporations, small businesses, the well-off that aren't paid. This is probably the only program that you will ever hear me say actually could pay for itself. So when you repeal IRS funding, that would be scored as making the deficit worse. So I loved the principle of let's pay for it. The one policy they picked to do so, I don't think really was the right one. But your question is more about politically, what does this mean? I think we're in a different situation with the Speaker. I think he has more leeway. I think that the members of his conference may disagree on specifics, but they understand how difficult this is, and they don't want to go through another exercise of kicking out the Speaker. So I think he's communicating with them and trying to figure out what to do. But this is really about House versus Senate and showing who's going to have the upper hand and creating what the agenda is for what emergency supplementals move forward and what the format of those bills are.
We're going to have a lot more on the contents of this border deal and break it down coming up with our panel a little bit later on this hour. But when I look around at what's happening here, Maya, and you're looking at the same calendar I am, there's going to be discord, apparently a lot of hand-wringing and gnashing of teeth over this. But we have less than a month to figure out how to keep the government from shutting down in March. And there are a couple of other issues that need to be handled as well, whether it's FAA or FISA. We've got this tax deal that was passed last week that may not see the light of day. I guess I'm wondering if you worry that this border debate with Ukraine and Israel attached bogs us down on a level where we can't get anything else done. Are we going to shut down in less than a month?
Well, listen, I worry about everything. There's lots to worry about, but I think there's actually capacity to deal with emergency supplementals, the border, tax deals, and funding of government if we work efficiently on these things. The problem is that there is a very small group of people who are really rolling up their sleeves and working on each of these issues, and then a lot of members in the House and the Senate kind of sitting on the sidelines waiting to see what happens. So we can work in this very differently. The process is not conducive to getting things done. But to go to your first point, which is so important, we are 1/3 of the way through the fiscal year. We have not passed a budget. We have not funded the government. And from everything I can see, we are doing very little to move those appropriations bills forward. I was really impressed when the Republicans were saying, we don't want another omnibus. That's where you hide all sorts of unpaid for legislation.
Sure.
They wanted to go through the actual act of budgeting. And I think calling for that's very important. But I just haven't seen any signs that as we are only 4 weeks away from that deadline, there's any progress being made on coming up those appropriations bills and, importantly, working out the differences between the House and the Senate, because the conversations I'm having right now, tensions between those bodies are also running very high.
Which makes me wonder, I have to ask you if at some point here, Maya, is it more likely that Joe Biden's State of the Union will be postponed because of a shutdown or canceled, or is it more likely that he'll give that speech, but Mike Johnson will not be sitting behind him?
Oh boy, that's a good one. Well, first off, each of the past could have been shutdown moments. I didn't think we were going to shut down. And I was pretty confident. I'm not quite as confident this time. I don't think we're going to shut down. I don't think it's in anybody's interest. And it's a very important political year where I think people are understanding that. But there's a risk this time that there wasn't last time, because I don't think there'll be further continuing resolutions. And there is a lot of resistance to one big funding or a couple big funding bills that kind of paper over the details. But I think we will see the State of the Union. I think that the Speaker will be there. I think it will be a political and contentious State of the Union, but I think it will go ahead as planned on the date.
And that, I think, we'll just go ahead and call progress if that happens. Maya McGinnis, I have to ask you about a big story here. You better believe it. I want to throw a big log on the fire while I have you in a couple of minutes that we have left. And the commentary that I saw you writing at the Post and Courier, Social Security is in trouble, is the headline. Most candidates won't admit it. This is for sure, Maya. We've been talking about this a lot in our campaign coverage. In fact, an interview that I had with Nikki Haley ended up being part of a Trump ad because she dared to answer a question about raising the age for eligibility for Social Security. Your point in this column is well taken. Considering the fact that no one will touch this, it's still in Al Gore's lockbox somewhere. Will we be able to have this conversation after the presidential campaign?
Yeah, that's what I'm really worried about. And I've been actually quite impressed with all of the coverage that you all are putting out there, because this is this issue that is so political and gets politicized and demagogued, and people just are outright not telling the truth. It's very difficult in a campaign cycle for the policies to get coverage. And I have to say that I have thought Nikki Haley has talked about this issue. She's talked about some of the things that she would do that would actually close the solvency gap. And while you've had a lot of other candidates, including both President Trump and President Biden, talking about what they won't do, the bottom line is Social Security and Medicare have trust funds that are going to become insolvent. Nobody likes it. Everybody who paid into the program does not appreciate the fact that these are structurally imbalanced, but there are lots of reasons for why. And the end result is we're going to have to make some changes. There are ways we can do this that will protect people who depend on the program, that make a lot of changes that start in the longer run so people have time to plan, younger people, not current retirees. But the more they demagogue, the candidates who do demagogue, the more they do, the more difficult it's going to be to fix this program after the campaign. And I'm so worried about that because there's no...
Come back and talk to this when we can talk about solutions, Maya McGinnis. This is Bloomberg.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet, 1221 on Wall Street. We are looking at a down Monday with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 Index, Russell 2000, all trading in the red. Traders are sending both stocks and bonds lower following stronger than estimated economic data and signals that the Fed is not ready to call victory over inflation just yet. S&P now down 20, drop there of 0.4%. Dow Industrials down 332. A decline of 0.9%. NASDAQ down 50, a drop of 0.3%. 10-year 4.15%, the 2-year 4.45%. Spot gold down $17 the ounce to $20.22. That is a drop now of 0.9%. West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 0.7%, $72.80 a barrel. Bitcoin down 0.3%, 42,637 on Bitcoin. McDonald's shares are down 4.4%. McDonald's sales missed investor expectations in the fourth quarter as growth decelerated, hurt in part by the conflict in the Middle East. Among McDonald's competitors, Wendy's down now by 1.1%. QSR, Restaurant Brands International, a parent of Burger King, down now by 2.1%. Recapping, stocks are lower. The S&P down 20, down 0.4. I'm Charlie Pellet. That Joe Matthew is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pellet, thank you and welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington with a deal at hand. We have been waiting since before the holidays for this. This was the deal that was going to change our lives, unlock funding for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan. Democrats and Republicans together, cats and dogs living together. But it's not feeling like that today. You might have seen Kirsten Sinema doing Sunday morning television, trying to express the virtues of this bill, the hard work done with James Lankford, Chris Murphy. We're not sure this is even going to pass the Senate now, never mind the House. So that's where we start our conversation with Jack Fitzpatrick. Our friend from Bloomberg Government is with us here. We should take, Jack, great to see you, take a moment to talk about what is actually in the bill, because it's been all leaks and hearsay until now. People are lifting stuff off Facebook, much to Jim Lankford's disappointment here. But some important stuff. We've got $14 billion for Israel as we expected, $60 billion for Ukraine. Indo-Pac gets almost $5 billion. There's money for humanitarian aid for civilians in Gaza. And then, of course, you've got the money for the border here. This is a deal that I think a lot of folks who've been watching this remember 2013, Marco Rubio. So this is a deal that even months ago could not have been envisioned, where they would strike a compromise like this, and they're already ready to throw it away. Is that Trump, or is there more to it?
A lot of it seems to be Trump. I mean, there was a preemptive rejection of this bill that wasn't even a bill yet by House Republicans in particular, who are more aligned with Trump, less willing to separate themselves than Mitch McConnell. Mm-hmm. There could be substantive concerns, certainly. If you are a hardline conservative and you believe that the president has the authority to shut down the border, then seeing the automatic the measures to force his hands if you're getting 5,000 people a day, I'm sure some of the most conservative lawmakers genuinely do not like this bill. Okay. But well before it came out, Trump was against it. House Republican leadership was feeling negative. The hardline conservatives were against it. This, as much as anything, shows Trump's effect and his ability to snap his fingers, and a bill has no support among the most conservative Republicans that gets to House leadership.
Amazing. So the narrative then will be for conservative Republicans, this doesn't go far enough. Not that we bailed on an opportunity to do something we've wanted to do for a generation.
It's simultaneously that it doesn't go far enough, but also now, despite the fact that House Republicans were the ones who said they wanted a bill along these lines, and that was the price you had to pay to get Ukraine aid, now it's also an insistence that this doesn't need to be legislated necessarily. This is in the president's hands, and there are criticisms of the bill, but also a criticism of the idea that it's Congress's job. So that plays into the Speaker of the House himself not proposing an alternate immigration bill. Really, the politics of this are, this is part of the presidential campaign, and it's in the president's hands.
But he passed H.R. 2. It's not like they haven't been in the business of
And yet,
lawmaking around the border.
For a while, you heard, give us all of H.R. 2.
That's right.
Now, much of the conversation in the House revolves around Trump. And, I mean, just
we don't
yesterday...
need a bill after all.
Just yesterday, the Freedom Caucus was saying, among the things they're talking about, we could do Israel aid, but we've got to offset the cost.
Yeah.
There's not an active counter-proposal, despite the H.R. 2 talk that's been going on for a while at this point.
I can't imagine what it's like to be one of these three negotiators here, especially. Here's your Republican, stuck his neck out to get this done. And he's being embarrassed by his colleagues, still confused at how it could be worse than expected. How does he rationalize the reaction that he's getting here, having been talking with his Republican leadership through this whole process?
Well, there's a big difference, one, between Senate Republican leadership and House Republican leadership, and this is negotiated on the Senate side.
Does he feel abandoned?
I doubt he feels abandoned by Mitch McConnell.
Yeah, right.
He knew for a while that the pressure was building. You could absolutely tell that there was a growing gap between the Senate and the House Republicans. This wasn't a surprise. It's been a forceful pushback from the House, but he has not been abandoned by Mitch McConnell. He hasn't been abandoned necessarily by the Senate. It was a little surprising or notable to see some pushback. Steve Daines opposes it, a leadership-aligned senator. John Cornyn, a former Senate Republican whip, says he has concerns in a statement to our colleague Eric Wasson. So it's getting toward leadership. He has not been abandoned by Mitch McConnell, but this is kind of highlighting the ways in which McConnell is not in line with all leadership-aligned Republicans in both chambers.
If Cornyn ends up saying no, is this over in the Senate?
That's a terrible sign for your ability to get 60. There are already some bad signs. It's a tougher hurdle in the Senate than I think we initially thought.
Well, so, my question for you would be about the House, but let's talk about that. What are the odds this gets 60 votes?
Chuck Schumer has said they're going to have the first procedural vote no later than Wednesday. They have teed this up to hold a vote, to have something that they see as a real bipartisan compromise. Again, if you're seeing Cornyn saying he has concerns, Daines saying he is a no, it looks tougher. It used to be, maybe they could get 60 votes in the Senate and the House is looking really rough. Right now, it's a high hurdle to get across the Senate. We haven't heard anything about them canceling plans or giving up yet, but it's a tough vote in the Senate for sure.
The statement from Speaker of the House as we go to the other chamber, I've seen enough. Thought he was about to call a race for the Cook Political Report. I've seen enough. The bill is even worse than we expected, he writes, and won't come close to ending the border catastrophe the president has created. As the lead Democrat negotiator proclaimed under this legislation, quote, the border never closes. He's referring to something Chris Murphy said about this idea that if we reach a certain threshold, whether it's 4,000 or 5,000 crossings a day, that would trigger an automatic, quote unquote, closing of the border. What does that language actually mean?
This almost takes us back, effectively kind of takes us back to the pandemic era restrictions. There's been a lot of, a long legal series of questions about how much the president has in which contexts to restrict people from coming across the border, even if they're claiming asylum, and how quickly you can kick people out if they do arrive here. So it is, in the view of the negotiator, the closest you can come to closing the border. One of the issues that conservatives has is this forces the president's hand if you're averaging 5,000 people coming across the border a day for a week. It gives him the option of doing this if it's at 4,000 a day. If you believe that the president has unlimited agency to close the border without citing a new law, then you believe that this is unnecessary.
Fine.
That's a tough legal question, and it's not taken as a given.
And we've heard it plenty of times on this broadcast. Just go back to Remain in Mexico, put Title 42 back in, and we live to see another day.
How do you put Title 42 back in? You have to negotiate a Remain in Mexico policy. This is a compromise
Those
that
are
gets
not just
toward
EOs, though, to your point. You can't just sign that and it happens.
I'm sure there is a lawyer who says that you can, and I believe those are the lawyers that the most conservative lawmakers are talking to, and that has led a number of lawmakers to say it's not Congress's role.
Amazing. All right. Jack is here, so I have to ask about a possible shutdown. We haven't talked about appropriations in a real way yet. Maya McGinnis just told us a little while ago she's getting a little more concerned that we might not meet this deadline on the 1st of March. How about you?
In terms of the timing, they can do it. The appropriators I've talked to, which include most of the subcommittee leaders who are going to have to write the bills, say they have time. There are tough issues. One big stumbling block is they don't have any kind of framework agreement on, are we putting major policy changes off the table? Usually when they strike a deal, they have a handshake deal to say, we're not getting into the Hyde Amendment and abortion restrictions. We're not getting into any big policy questions. They don't have an agreement there, but they still have time. They have numbers. They can negotiate these bills.
Yeah.
If the will is there, it is possible for them to get a deal. But Congress has been absolutely crazy for a year or so.
If this doesn't happen, does the State of the Union get postponed?
Not necessarily. I mean, by scheduling
that's a partial
right
shutdown that
of
week, right? Yeah.
The
1st and the 8th. The State of the Union would be on the 7th, I believe.
The 7th.
So maybe he threads the needle on that.
If you're the president and you're fighting with Congress that much through a partial shutdown, you may want to give a joint address.
Sure.
They've given joint addresses. They've had State of the Union addresses at some pretty crazy times. It was basically the beginning of the COVID pandemic. It wasn't a pandemic yet. So not necessarily, but the 1st being a deadline, the 7th being the State of the Union, the 8th being a deadline, and the 11th being when the White House wants to send their next budget proposal is a wild, wild march.
Can we add Super Tuesday? Is on the 5th that week. Who's counting? Don't take that week off, Jack. Great conversation. Thanks for bringing us up to date. This is a lot of important stuff that you're not going to hear about in most areas today because we try to take the deep dive on policy and let you know as much as we can about it. We'll have more straight ahead with our panel, Rick Davis and G.D. Shanzano, after we check world and national news with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hey, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. U.S. officials are pushing for an extended pause in fighting between Israel and Hamas to allow for more hostage releases from Gaza. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is back in the region, though Biden officials do say the prospects for a deal are not imminent. We get more with Julie Norman, co-director of the Center on U.S. Politics at University College London.
Antony Blinken is back in the region this week trying to lean into that deal even further and try and get it across the line, even though I would say that there's still a lot of ways to go there. But that really will be, I think, the linchpin in diffusing the rest of the conflicts in the region is if there can be some kind of ceasefire, temporary or otherwise, in Gaza.
That's Julie Norman with University College of London speaking with Bloomberg. A second atmospheric river in a week is bringing severe flooding to Los Angeles, triggering mudslides in and out of Malibu. Hour knocking down trees and power. Hussein Ahmed, Sacramento, when the storm hit.
Out of nowhere, a big gust of wind came at 60 miles an hour. And a tree toppled over, hit my car.
Downtown Los Angeles saw its wettest day in nearly 20 years yesterday. Night is in the books. Taylor Swift made Grammy history with her 4th Album of the Year win for Midnights.
All I want to do is keep doing this. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to do what I love.
Miley Cyrus nabbed her first ever Grammy for Record of the Year. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons.
Bloomberg World Headquarters. I'm Charlie Pellet. We are looking at a down day on Wall Street, off session lows right now with the S&P down 10 points, a decline of 0.2%. Dow Industrials down 261, drop there of 0.7%. The Nasdaq Composite Index down 14, a decline of 0.1%. 10-year 4.14%, with the 2-year that's yielding 4.44%. Gold down $15 the ounce, down 0.8%. And West Texas Intermediate crude 73 even a barrel, up by just about 1%. America's service sector expanded at the fastest pace in 4 months in January, rebounding from lackluster showings at the end of 2023. And with more on the story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
New orders led the way. Service industry employment also perked up a bit. However, a gauge of the cost of materials flashed a warning as war in the Middle East affects shipping costs. Carriers are rerouting over longer distances. The service sector data are compiled monthly by the Institute for Supply Management. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Novo Nordisk has agreed to buy 3 manufacturing plants for $11 billion to help it meet surging demand for the obesity drug Wegovy and diabetes shot Ozempic. Novo Holdings also agreed to buy the owner of the assets, Catalent, in a deal with an enterprise value of $16.5 billion. Novo, the ADR, is up by 3.6%. Catalent now up by about 9.5%. Recapping, stocks are lower. We are off session lows. S&P down 11 now, drop there of 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That Joe Matthew is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, we thank you and welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power here on the radio, the satellite, and on YouTube. I'm glad to say Kaylee Lines is back and will join us next hour as we add the audience of Bloomberg TV to the mix here with a lot to discuss today. As I've been telling you, we're following 2 major stories. One is a border deal that we've spent quite a bit of time on here so far this hour. Text did emerge last night from the Senate, where negotiators must be scratching their heads because we're told this thing might not even pass the Senate, never mind the House, where it has been declared DOA. The other story, continued airstrikes, a 3rd day of strikes now against Iranian-backed groups throughout the Middle East. As we add Yemen to the list now, it was Iraq and Syria Saturday and Friday. When it began Sunday, we add Yemen. And there are questions about how long this might last and what impact, if any, that it will have. Remembering the reluctance that the administration has, for many good reasons, to strike Iran directly. Let's assemble our panel. It's been a busy weekend. We have a lot to discuss with Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick, you've been around this border debate for a long time, and I'm looking forward to your insights, but I'd like to hear from both of you here on the strikes that appear to be continuing and the reluctance to hit Iran directly. Jeannie, is the administration taking the right approach here, because the president's being criticized from the right and the left?
Yeah, he is being criticized. I don't think any of us could argue that the first wave, at least, was very tough. I mean, to hit 85, 86 sites simultaneously is impressive. And so we have to say that that was a show of force. I think where I have some qualms about what is happening is in a different area, and that is in the failure of the president to come out publicly and explain what we are doing. The power of the presidency is limited. The power is the bully pulpit, number one. Richard Neustadt told us that a long time ago. He's got to use that and explain to the American public, not just the investments, you're talking about immigration and Ukraine, all that stuff, but why we have entered a war, why we are hitting back. And to say in the toughest language possible that when you hit U.S. citizens, especially our military folks, we will hit you back tough. So I think that's the part of it that concerns me more than actually the first wave or now the second wave of attacks themselves.
I had a feeling you might say that. Rick, I wonder your thoughts on whether Joe Biden needs to talk to the American people. Wouldn't Friday have been a good time to maybe have an Oval Office address before everybody went home for the weekend, explain what is happening and why?
Yeah, I understand. You know, he was at Dover to receive the remains of fallen service members. And frankly, that's the highest national priority we have for president. But yeah, I don't disagree that there needs to be this administration's more aggressive articulation of the plan. Frankly, he could have done it on Monday. He indicated to the world, including to the Iranians, that he was going to hit these targets. They just didn't know where. But it was plenty of time for them to move strategic individuals out of the way of fire. And that's the part I don't understand. We gave 4 days for the Iranians to react to what they knew was coming. They just didn't know when. So I agree with Jeannie. I mean, 85, different, targets in 11 different locations. That's a great show of force. But the reality is, how many of them were in empty parking lots that had been long since abandoned because we warned them so much in advance. So this is the parts of this whole equation that I don't get. And the sites we're hitting are very similar to the sites we've been hitting for months. These are repeated attacks on these groups that hasn't resulted in a change of behavior on Iran.
You also wonder how quickly Iran might be able to resupply them. Enter Anthony Blinken, Jeannie, the Secretary of State, traveling, and this is the latest trip now, number 5 since October 7th. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Qatar, Israel, and the West Bank. What's the purpose of the trip, if not just trying to keep everybody on the same page here while we're, I guess, escalating this, if I can use that term? Or is he there to talk about a ceasefire in Gaza?
I think it's all of the above. He is engaged in shuttle diplomacy. I think the president's team, from Anthony Blinken on down on this, have been spectacular. But they have to, again, share what is going on with the American public. I mean, when you ask people, quite frankly, what is the Biden administration interested in vis-a-vis this issue? They talk about de-escalation. And that is an absolutely valid idea. But if we are hit and you're going to hit back, then you need to come out and say that. And another thing I would wish the administration would do, and this gets back to Anthony Blinken's trips, is they would also talk about the American hostages that are still being held by Hamas. You take 2 weeks to negotiate with Hamas. That doesn't come through. We believe it may not. Hopefully it does. But what are you going to do about that? We hear very little from this administration about those prisoners or hostages rather, and we should hear about them every day and what they are doing to get the Americans over there and, quite frankly, all the hostages back.
Well, it's a great point, Rick. None of this would be happening. We wouldn't be talking about Yemen or Iraq or Syria, at least not to the extent that we are, if it weren't for what's happening in Gaza. Is that Secretary Blinken's top goal, to find another truce, if we can call it that, a pause, to try to get these 100+ people out?
Sure. It's a very traditional ceasefire for hostage deal, and that should be his highest priority. That's his job. He's not the combatant. You have an entire Department of Defense to inflict pain on our enemies. But his job is to make sure that we secure the well-being of our people and those who are other people who have taken it hostage. And the might of the U.S. in its diplomatic capabilities is pretty significant. So he needs to use that might to try and get a deal. And if that deal can last the test of time, in other words, longer than a couple of 3 days, then maybe cooler heads can prevail and we can tone it down in the conflict zone inside of Gaza to the point where we could actually get our people out and stabilize the region a little bit. There's no question that part of what has facilitated these attacks is the ongoing fight in Gaza. And right now, the diplomatic road is the only way that anybody can see that ending in the short term.
We've only got 1 minute left here, Jeannie. Should the president prepare to ask Congress for authorization for continued strikes?
Yeah, I mean, he's going to have to deal with that. I don't think that is imminent right now. But what I do think he should be talking about again is what he is doing and why. And he needs to say it not just once, but repeatedly. What is his plan in the Middle East and why is he hitting back? And to remind the world that when they kill U.S. military folks, he is going to strike back hard. And de-escalation should not be the first word out of everyone's mouth when they talk about his plan.
Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors, in the pocket here this day off the weekend with a lot of news to talk about. We're going to look at the campaign trail ahead with Rick and Jeannie, and we will get their take on this border deal that seems to be getting everybody upset outside of the 3 people who negotiated it. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Kaylee Lyons is back today. She'll be here in hour 2 of Balance of Power, so stay right where you are on Bloomberg.
your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Media entrepreneur Byron Allen says he has begun talks with Paramount Global on his $14.3 billion offer to acquire the film and TV giant. Allen, who also owns the Weather Channel and a string of local TV stations, made an offer last week to buy Paramount, which also owns the CBS broadcast network, as well as cable channels like MTV and the Paramount Pictures Film Studio. Paramount Global down now by 2.1%. Boeing found more mistakes with holes drilled in the fuselage of its 737 MAX jet, a setback that could further slow deliveries on a critical program already restricted by regulators over quality lapses. Boeing shares down another 2%. Caterpillar battled away concerns of a global economic slowdown with higher fourth quarter sales in its energy and transportation businesses, helping the global machinery maker post profit that topped analyst expectations. Kristen Owen is a senior analyst at Oppenheimer, and she spoke about the pricing outlook this morning on Bloomberg Markets.
So 2023, really strong pricing, 9.5% for the full year. 2024, earnings are going to have to be driven more by profitability or by productivity, by cost controls, because we're looking at something that goes from 9.5% to just about 1.5% for the full year 24. Really puts that emphasis on productivity.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Markets podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Boeing, our shares right now of Caterpillar, they are up by 1.9%. And those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pellet, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Balance of Power with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
It began about a week ago in South Carolina. It continued this past weekend in Las Vegas. Joe Biden's attempt to win back black and brown voters. He's been struggling with now for the better part of a year or two based on a number of reasons that we've seen emerge in polls, knowing that this was a very different story in 2020. 4 years ago, Joe Biden won more than 6 in 10 of Nevada's Hispanic voters, the state's biggest non-white voting group, 80% of the black vote as well, which helped him to a 2 percentage point victory over Donald Trump. He's now trailing Donald Trump by 8 percentage points in a hypothetical rematch in Nevada, according to Bloomberg News Morning Consult polling. And that's where we start with our panel this time around. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Jeannie, what's he going to do other than show up and keep beating the drum, trying to tell this story over and over again? He got to the constitutional crisis that he believes would emerge under a second Trump administration. That was the message this past weekend. Is that enough?
You know, he's got a lot of work to make up. You just mentioned the Bloomberg Consult poll. In all of these states, he is trailing Donald Trump. We saw the NBC News poll over the weekend. I think the stunning part of that was that Trump is leading by Hispanic and Latino voters. I mean, it's almost unheard of when you think about it, particularly as we look back at, say, 2012, when Republicans really feared that because they had, when they lost, that they had really to make up some ground there. Donald Trump has at least come roaring back with that constituency. So he has some work to do, but I would just say that when you look historically, that these are places that George Bush won in 2004 and Joe Biden won in 2020. He's shown he can do it. And of course, now most of the elected officials out there at the legislative level, House and Senate, are from the Democratic Party. So the Southwest has been a story of success for Democrats over the last several years, but he's going to have to work it for 2024.
Rick, Joe Biden's been criticized a lot lately because of the civilian deaths and casualties in Gaza. There's a lot more to this, though. He was struggling with black voters long before anything ever started in Gaza due to what many see as promises not kept when it comes to student loan relief, when it comes to electoral reform, when it comes to something like legalizing cannabis. What should be his narrative going into a general election?
Yeah, and there's no question that some of these, call them cultural issues, have dragged down, frankly, the Democrats at every level. I mean, Joe Biden isn't the only one who's suffering from this kind of deflation of support amongst minority groups. You know, whether you track it back to George Floyd and the riots that year, where there was no substantial legislation passed that addressed those kinds of issues related to civil rights and injustice. Add that to what you just described, some of the economic issues around student loans. He couldn't make that stick. He tried the executive order strategy, and the courts took him down on it. So he's been really dragged down by these cultural issues, and frankly, you don't hear him talking about it very much. I would say on the Hispanic side, Republicans have been winning Hispanic votes for a long time. My old boss, John McCain, used to win, a super majority of Hispanics in Arizona and was very popular amongst Hispanics when he ran for president. So that's not so unusual to think about. Hispanics tend to be more conservative. They are more likely to attend religious worship, and they are small business owners by a significantly higher degree than the national average. So these are people who actually are ready-made for a Republican message. Frankly, if they can find it amongst the haze and mist that's created by Donald Trump's cultural debate.
A lot to be said there. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano will be back with us in 20 minutes for their take on the border deal that came out over the weekend. Kaylee Lyons will join us as well as we follow these two stories on the border and on airstrikes continuing. Hour 2 of Balance of Power starts right now.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Washington, D.C.
They finally struck a deal on the border, and it may already be dead. Welcome to the fastest show in politics with breaking news from Capitol Hill, an actual bill on the border emerging from the Senate, while separately the U.S. continuing strikes against Iranian-backed groups in the Middle East. We have a lot to cover this hour with two major stories coming out of Washington, and glad to say that Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons is back with us today. Kaylee, your timing is perfect. Lovely to see you as we try to decipher these two massive stories. We've talked for weeks, if not months, about a border deal, and it's out.
It's out, and we knew before it even came out, the actual text, that is, that Speaker Johnson likely wasn't going to go for it in the House. He reconfirmed that last night, said it's dead on arrival, and actually the rest of Republican leadership, together with Johnson today, put out a statement saying any consideration of this Senate bill in its current form is a waste of time. Again, repeating, dead on arrival in the House.
You do wonder if this had been a couple of months ago, how this might have played before Donald Trump got involved. And we'll get into that coming up as well. Kaylee, we're having trouble counting the number of airstrikes now. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, expanding beyond Iraq and Syria now to include Houthi rebels in Yemen. And the administration says we're not done.
No, they forecast that these operations could go on for some time. We don't actually know the duration of time or if they're going to take different shape, different form than they have already. They don't want to telegraph directly what they're going to do, but there has been a lot of talk, Joe, about how telegraphed, in large part, at least to Iran, the moves the U.S. has made already have been.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that coming up with retired Lieutenant General David Deptula, retired Air Force general who knows a lot about what's going on here. We'll also connect with the head of our Congress team, Megan Scully, here in Washington to bring you the news as it happens here directly on Balance of Power. And we start, as always, on Wall Street. Let's get up to date first on trading from New York. Here's Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much, Joe and Kaylee. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all trading lower. Do want to begin, though, with a headline right off the Bloomberg Professional Service. The Department of Justice has launched a probe into Archer Daniels Midland over its accounting practices. ADM shares down now by 4.1%. That story breaking right now with a headline on the Bloomberg Professional Service. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, as I mentioned, in the red right now. Dow. The Dow Jones Industrial Average lower, little change now, down 15 points, down by about 0.3%. S&P down 36, drop there of 0.2%. NASDAQ lower by 40 points, a decline there of 0.2%. Traders are sending stocks and bonds lower following stronger than estimated economic data and signals that the Federal Reserve is not ready to call victory over inflation just yet. 10-year yield 4.14%, the 2-year 4.44%. Spot gold down 0.7%, 20.26 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.2%, 73.16 for a barrel of WTI. Tyson Food shares up 2%. Tyson posted quarterly earnings that beat even the highest of analyst estimates. Again, recapping, stocks lower. S&P right now trading down 37 points, down 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pellet. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington once again. Joe Matthew, Kaylee Lines.
All right, Charlie, we thank you. We'll get an update on trading again a little bit later on this hour. Thank you, Charlie Pellet in New York. Kaylee, it's great to see you again here on the fastest show in politics. The line that sticks with me, what James Lankford must have thought when he woke up this morning. These guys have been locked in a room negotiating a deal that we were told was impossible. They got it done. Lankford, Sinema, Murphy.
Yep.
You finally get this thing done. You do what they said was impossible. And they tell you that it's garbage and it will never pass. DOA was the word from Speaker. Lankford, quote, I'm a little confused at how it could be worse than expected, because they expected it to be pretty bad.
Yeah, they had been saying that for some time. I mentioned the statement we got from House Republican leadership. In part, it said House Republicans oppose the Senate immigration bill because it fails in every policy area needed to secure our border.
So there's not one good thing. The whole thing fails.
If you're judging by this statement, yes.
Wow. And of course, Lankford, the Republican here, not a liberal, thought he was doing something historic. And we've seen this happen each time over history when they thought they had a deal on the border.
Well, and he definitely was operating with the knowledge that it was going to be difficult to get the House ultimately to swallow this down. And yet even some of his own Republican colleagues in the Senate are saying that they're hard-nosed on this deal. You may not even be able to get a majority of the Senate minority to pass this
Now,
thing.
John Cornyn might be turning, and that's, I mean, that would be, talk about DOA, right? If you lost Cornyn, you've lost the Senate. Mike Johnson plowing ahead with his own standalone Israel aid bill this week. It's not paid for, by the way, like the last one claimed to be. So it's hard to tell where we are. Donald Trump calls the bill mass amnesty, which I'm pretty sure it's not. Megan Scully will figure it out for us. She runs our Congress coverage team. Imagine the weekend they had. Megan Scully, great to see you.
Thank you.
Was this all a waste of time?
You know, I think a lot of people in Washington are wondering that, including perhaps Senator Lankford. Trump's statement today, calling it a death wish for the Republican Party, certainly doesn't help to sell it in either the House or the Senate. I think a crucial moment today will be this evening, at least in the Senate, when Senate Republicans meet behind closed doors.
That'll be fun.
And we'll get a sense for whether McConnell can keep this fragile coalition together. You know, it used to be a sign in Washington that when everybody hated a piece of legislation, that was a mark of a good compromise. You know, there was enough in there to get everyone to get on board because of X, Y, or Z provision. But now in Washington, it seems to be all or nothing. Either it's everything I want or I'm against it. And that is where House Republicans are, and what seems to be potentially a growing number of Senate Republicans as well.
I want to return to the subject of the leadership in the House. But first, actually, Joe, we have some breaking news regarding the United Kingdom, because King Charles, according to Buckingham Palace, has been diagnosed with a form of cancer. At this time, the palace is not confirming the type of cancer, but says that the king has started undergoing treatments as of Monday. His Majesty, according to the statement, commenced a schedule of what will be regular treatments, during which time he has been advised by doctors to postpone public-facing duties. And we know already that recently, Joe, he had undergone treatment for an enlarged prostate. The palace had revealed that within the last several weeks. But again, King Charles has now been diagnosed with cancer. So this is a story we will be continuing to keep on top of. But of course, Megan, here in Washington, we have to keep on top of what's happening on Capitol Hill as well. And of course, we've talked a lot about the reception of this border deal on the Republican side. There's been some backlash on the Democratic side as well. Senator Padilla, for example, had some pretty strict words, a Democrat from California, about what this this deal could mean. So how should we be thinking about the votes that could be lost on the left too?
Sure. So there's probably 4, maybe 5 Senate Democrats who will vote against the bill, which, remember, we need to get to 60 votes in order for this to clear a procedural hurdle on Wednesday. So it's not at all clear whether there's going to be enough support in both parties to get to that crucial 60 vote margin. Padilla's against it. We expect some others on the left to be against it as well. In the House, it's a similar dynamic, with the House progressives not happy with the immigration provisions as they're laid out.
Well, I'll tell you, it's going to be interesting to see where we go beyond Wednesday. If it doesn't reach that threshold in the Senate, we're done. Is that right?
On this particular bill, yes. But the House is trying to move forward with its own Israel aid package.
Which will not see the light of day in the Senate.
We will see what happens with that. It gets very murky. That could then become a negotiating point for Ukraine aid, perhaps.
Sure. Yep.
But it all gets very tricky with difficult votes for both parties in both chambers.
Absolutely. I mean, that $17 billion package, to your point, Joe, does not have the IRS money getting pulled out of it as the first Israel bill does. But does that make it more digestible for a Democratic-controlled Senate that would also like to see Ukraine aid? I think that's the question.
I'm not so sure about that. Remembering, of course, that first Israel bill that was funded with the IRS money would have actually added to the deficit and the national debt. So I'm not sure that we've really gotten to anything realistic yet. But Megan, it's great to see you. Thank you for the update.
Thank you.
Megan Scully with us today on Balance of Power as we balance a couple of stories today, Kaylee.
Yeah, including, as we mentioned, the diagnosis of King Charles with cancer. His Majesty is grateful for his medical team, according to the statement, for their intervention and remains wholly positive about his treatment. But we're going to have more on that with Bloomberg's very own Caroline Hyde coming up in just a moment. But, Joe, we also have to talk about something the UK has been involved in with the U.S. in recent weeks, which is strikes in the Middle East. We've, of course, seen a multitude of them over the weekend. And joining us now is General David Deptula, Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and, of course, a former U.S. Air Force retired Lieutenant General. So, Lieutenant General, thank you so much for joining us. If you could just react to what we have seen develop over the weekend, the actions the U.S. has taken thus far, how escalatory in nature were they to you?
Well, first, Joe and Kaylee, thanks for having me to join into this very important discussion. The bottom line up front is that the airstrikes this past Friday against the Iranian militia groups were an appropriate response. And quite frankly, it's good to hear that they're the first part of a series of operations that will continue to degrade Iranian militias that are attacking U.S. forces. This is not a one-and-done kind of attack. Iranian proxies in the area are numerous and robust. Frankly, as I mentioned, it's about time, it's well past time that the United States signify the importance of responding to the kinds of aggression that its forces are facing in the region.
Yeah. I want to hear about some of the choices that the Pentagon made here. General, knowing that you flew the F-15, we saw B-1s fly around the world from bases here in the U.S. to take part in that initial strike on Friday. Saw the Navy get involved with F-18s off the USS Eisenhower over the course of the weekend. Some cruise missiles have been used here. What do you make about the selections of hardware? How effective was it?
Well, first, the military commands in the region are still assessing impact, but if you look at the use of the B-1, which many people are wondering, well, why did he do that, and launch it from the United States, I'd tell you that first, it induced a degree of surprise with respect to adversaries in the region. Second, it's an aircraft that has a very large precision payload. In other words, it can drop many weapons from one platform and stay airborne for long periods of time. And finally, it also signaled that the United States can project power without local basing. Our U.S.-based bombers can reach anywhere in the world in a matter of hours. It doesn't take weeks or months to do so. So, by the way, as you mentioned over the weekend, but even on that strike on Friday, the B-1s were not the only aircraft that were used. U.S. Air Force aircraft are deployed to the Middle East, and they were also part of the attacks that you saw on Friday.
Well, Lieutenant General, you mentioned the projection of power on the part of the U.S. How much power is projected if the signal being sent is that the U.S. is reluctant to directly strike Iran in its own territory? Is the U.S. giving too much away here in terms of what it is not willing to do, what power it will not utilize?
Kayleigh, that's a wonderful question. Let me speak for a moment about deterrence. And let me remind your audience that the way one deters a wider war is not by saying that you don't want a wider war or that we won't strike inside Iran, but by making sure Iran understands that if they and their proxies continue attacks on U.S. personnel, then they can expect disastrous consequences. In other words, deterrence is achieved by instilling in the minds of the Iranian leadership sufficient uncertainty of achieving their objectives so that they decide not to continue their attacks due to the potential consequences. So I'm afraid that attacks on U.S. forces in the region won't stop until Iran understands that their critical interests are at stake. So the administration has to stop telling our enemies what the U.S. is not going to do, is that only will encourage them to continue their attacks. So I got to tell you, it's very frustrating. And frankly, the kind of attacks you saw on Friday and follow on the weekend are ones that should have been conducted when attacks against U.S. forces commenced back last year. That would have increased the probability of deterring the 4 months of attacks on U.S. forces since then.
Well, are you taking them at their word here? We were speaking with Michael Knights a couple of days ago, General. He said we are out of rungs on the escalation ladder. If this doesn't work in, say, a couple of weeks and we're still playing with this, is a strike against Iran out of the question?
Well, no, it shouldn't be out of the question. And quite frankly, as I just said, we shouldn't be telling or telegraphing what we may or may not be doing. What I'd tell you is that actions directly against Iran will be fundamental to halt their continued aggression and the aggression by their clients. Now, that action can take many forms. It can be lethal, non-lethal, economic, diplomatic, deterrent, or a combination of all of these. And while I don't want to get into specifics in terms of what I would target, because all that does is aid the Iranians, I believe that it would be wise to initiate full-up sanctions on Iran against all forms of their economic income, particularly their oil exports, and then, if necessary, direct attacks against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps leadership, their key essential systems which allow them to function, their infrastructure, their personnel, and their deployed forces. And again, without getting into specifics, those are some general areas that Iran needs to be put on notice, are liable to be struck, and that may have the effect of deterring the Iranians. But we also have to be ready to back up these statements. So we're not, I mean, Michael's a friend of mine, but I have to tell you, no, we're not anywhere close to getting to the last rung in the escalation ladder.
Well, of course, when we're thinking about rungs and ladders here, there is the ladder in terms of how financing from Iran goes to these different proxy groups. As we talk here about deterring Iran, are we assuming that the connection between Iran and its proxies are strong enough that that directly translates? Or is there a certain degree of control that Tehran, even if it decided it wanted to, cannot exercise over some of these groups?
And again, another great question. The short answer is complex, but that's why I said that with respect to deterrence, we have to keep the issue of actions directly against the government of Iran on the table. Only when they understand that their critical interests are threatened will they pull back the throttles on the aggression that they may, in fact, be orchestrating. Yes, to a degree, there is some independence of these proxy groups, But these proxy groups rely 100% on Iran for their military capabilities.
All right, Lieutenant General, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time. That was Lieutenant General David Deptula, who is now Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. We really appreciate your time. We want to turn, though, now back to the breaking news we received this hour, which is that King Charles III has been diagnosed with cancer, according to Buckingham Palace, and will now receive the appropriate treatment. The palace has not told us which type of cancer was found, but has ruled out prostate cancer. So let's go now in New York to Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde, who is covering this story for us. So Caroline, we don't know the type of cancer. Do we know anything about the severity, the prognosis here?
Well, all we can do is read between the lines. Ultimately, he says he will be continuing with his work. He will still be doing paperwork and the like, but he will no longer be seen doing face-to-face meetings anymore. So he obviously wants to step out of the limelight. Now, just remember, we did see him just yesterday on Sunday. He was attending church in Sandringham, so clearly still able-bodied and fit. It was after we understand that there was a more rudimental sort of prospect of him going to a hospital. It was the London clinic where they were investigating an enlarged prostate, but then also he at the time then was looking into other concerns that he had, other health issues, and that is where they then understood to have found that there was some cancer within him. But as I say, they go out to rule out prostate cancer, but have not gone on to tell us exactly what form of cancer. But it is notable that at the age of 75, he's wanting to make this public. He's wanting to be able to bring what he says, more understanding, public understanding for all those in the world who are affected by cancer. And very sadly, we know that is many.
Yeah, absolutely. And Caroline, as you said, he intends to continue his work, even if not performing as many duties in public. So will this, in the interim period in which he is receiving this treatment, change anything about the functioning of the monarchy? Could we expect that Prince William, for example, will be taking a more forward role here?
I don't want to speculate as to what the next steps will be. Ultimately, we just need to remember the context of this is he only took up the role some 17 months ago. And notably, this has been in a run of relative health scares surrounding the entirety of the royal family. Now, we understand that just recently, the Princess of Wales herself, so that is Prince William's wife, Kate Middleton, had some major abdominal, I can't even say that word, surgery. Sarah, Duchess of York, as many of us would colloquially know her as Fergie, of course, the former wife of Prince Andrew, she herself has also been diagnosed with skin cancer. Many will leap to conclusions, of course, of the health issues that the Queen's own father had, of course, King George, but that was after having been a heavy smoker, and that was indeed something to do with his breathing. But ultimately, this is something that we cannot speculate as to what will ultimately mean as to who takes up what roles and when. But for now, we do understand that King Charles will be stepping out of the limelight and postponing public-facing duties.
To what extent can he continue in his constitutional role, even if we're not seeing him in a ceremonial sense?
Well, I think he's, from a perspective of a positive mindset, it feels as though he can continue overall. I mean, they are saying that at the moment he will continue with his roles and he will be overall focusing more on the regular day-to-day, the fact that he will be able to do official papers, they say, state business. So the behind-the-scenes work will still be there. But of course, from a geopolitical perspective, from being the person who can go out and talk to the public or indeed make trips abroad, that will have to go to the backseat for the time being.
Caroline Hyde, we thank you as always. Of course, co-host Bloomberg Technology with us in the clutch here with breaking news. Kaylee, we're spinning a few plates at this point because we were already in a world in which we had two major stories developing here in Washington, the border deal and, of course, the airstrikes. And it's an opportunity now to bring in our signature panel, of course, back with us every Monday. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors, are here. It's a story we haven't had a chance to get your take on yet because we didn't see text until late in the weekend. Most folks waking up to it this morning. Rick and Jeannie, a deal on the border that was said to be elusive for so long has actually been reached, and we're told that it is already dead, not just in the House, but in the Senate itself, where this deal emerged. Rick Davis, you spent some time around this issue in your time working with John McCain. A lot of folks didn't think we'd ever get to this moment again. How could Republicans be so willing to throw it away?
Yeah, suffice it to say, this is not comprehensive immigration reform, right? This is a border deal.
Fair
it's
enough.
very focused on issues related to border incursions, but it's a big deal, as you point out. Nothing like this has been done in decades, and so really not since Ronald Reagan. So that's beyond just decades. And the reality to this too is there's still a chance. These things are always determined to be dead until they're not. The key, I think, for me is what kind of vote can the Republicans produce in the Senate on Wednesday during these procedural votes. It's a fight within the Republican caucus. I mean, Senator Cruz really took the Minority Leader Mitch McConnell to the woodshed on this, went after him directly. You never see that kind of thing happen. It's sort of like a civil war within the Republican caucus within the United States Senate. So that is exacerbating the ability to figure out where people stand on this. So if you could get to 15 Republicans voting for passage of this, that then puts a lot of heat on Republicans in the House. They all of a sudden are going to have a little bit more momentum coming out of the Senate, and things that are being said today may not stick, by the end of the week. Yeah. So I'd say too early to tell. The rumors of its demise are grossly exaggerated.
Well, as we talk about things that are happening today, statements that are made today, Jeannie, of course, former President Donald Trump had some thoughts on this bill. He posted on Truth Social, this ridiculous border bill is nothing more than a highly sophisticated trap for Republicans to assume the blame on what the radical left Democrats have done to our border just in time for the most important ever election. Don't fall for it. How much of this is because of what Donald Trump wants the House to do, Jeannie?
I think it's a combination. There's no question that Donald Trump wants to run on three things: the border, crime, and the economy. He is becoming increasingly concerned, and we heard him say it, that the economy as an issue is slipping away as the numbers look so good. And he the other day said, in fact, the numbers are probably looking good because he's on the ballot and likely to win the election. So, he's also trying to take credit for the economy. With that gone, he's left with the border and crime, and he can't see that go away. So he is pushing members of the caucus not to give Joe Biden a win on this. But you also do hear from Republicans who feel that the bill doesn't go far enough. I think, though, the thing to look at is, number one, how many of them took the time to read the bill, which just came out late yesterday before they said that. And number two, if that's the case, what can you expect out of a negotiation? As we look back on the last big border bill or immigration bill, what Marco Rubio helped construct, that was truly a negotiation. As I look at this one, it is not. It is all security. They don't even mention the dreamers in this bill, those childhood arrivals, illegal arrivals. So, it's not a negotiation. This is a huge win for Republicans. The question is, do they want to take it despite the political impact on Donald Trump? And I think the answer so far seems to be no.
So to your point, Jeannie, this bill does not provide pathways to citizenship for undocumented immigrants already here. Doesn't matter their age. To your point, no mention of dreamers. We do have a component here on employment visas, but what did Democrats get?
Well, that's the issue, right? And, I'll tell you what they got. I think what they're doing is trying to...
They got Ukraine. That's the point, isn't it?
Well, they do get Ukraine. They do get Israel. They do get those things. But on the issue, they are being hit so hard. Look at the NBC poll. Donald Trump is so far ahead of Biden on this issue. This third Democratic race, the special election where I am in New York to fill the seat, we have Tom Suozzi, a Democrat, running hard on security at the border, because this is an issue that they can't leave where it is, because it's an issue at the front of the minds of not just conservative voters, but moderates, liberals, independents. So they want to take it away and show that they are tough on the border as well.
Well, Joe brought up Ukraine aid, Rick, and of course that's something that another person we haven't directly talked about yet, the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, has been very passionate about in advocating for an agreement to come together so that Ukraine can get that aid in addition for these border security measures. But I wonder if Mitch McConnell himself is now at risk here. You look at the tweets from the likes of Senator Mike Lee, who said, Senate GOP leadership screwed this up and screwed us. This is a disqualifying betrayal. Should McConnell be worried, Rick?
You know, look, there have been attempts on McConnell's leadership in the past. They've tended to melt away. But there's been a lot happening over the course of the last year, including the rise of Donald Trump, who's always been a foe to Mitch McConnell. And that doesn't help either. It certainly gives more impetus to the Mike Lees and to the Ted Cruzes and the Josh Hawleys, who have always been antagonists to Mitch McConnell. Only time will tell, and certainly I don't think within this Congress anything is going to happen in the short run, but how does that affect the agenda? Mitch McConnell has staked a lot of his leadership credibility on getting funding for Ukraine. This is, he believes, an existential issue for Europe, and he has really put it to the Republican caucus. Now, if this fails, is there a separate deal to try and get passage of funding for Ukraine, similar to what the House is doing around Israel? We don't know yet, and we still think it's premature, you know, to say that the current supplemental package is completely dead. So, first act: can Mitch McConnell produce 15 to 20 Republicans by Wednesday to support a rule on this in the Senate, which will give an indication that there's some momentum behind Mitch McConnell's plan to fund this. And to be honest with you, I think the weakness of his argument is that it's turned on the border. When he was pitching Ukraine, it was a pretty very specific thing. You know, they need the money now and they need the weapons to fight Russia. Very few Republicans would even walk out on a limb saying, no, right, you know, we ought to withdraw from that. He could easily get 15 to 20 Republicans for Ukraine aid in the Senate right now. But on this deal, it's now speculative whether they can pull this off.
We should talk about what's in it, especially since so many people are getting their news from Facebook and totally uncredible sources leading us to the text. It's actually out now. Kaylee, it makes it more difficult for migrants to apply for and qualify for asylum, tightening that definition. People thought that would never happen. Encourages faster resolution to asylum cases at the border. We heard Kirsten Sinema on Sunday morning talking about this. We will deal with your case the minute you get there. No more catch and release. Creates new expedited removal authority for those who do not qualify. They send you back home. And it scales back the president's use of parole, probably the most controversial element that we had here at land ports of entry, and of course hiring of thousands new Border Patrol and asylum officers. Rick, real quick, before we ask Jeannie about this, if you went back a couple of months or years and you looked at that list that I just ran down, would you not expect most Republicans to vote for it?
Yeah, these are all things that Republicans have been arguing for. You asked Jeannie earlier, what did Democrats get in this bill? Virtually nothing. This is a Republican bill that got a bipartisan endorsement because of all the things Jeannie said. You know, the politics of this are really breaking against the Democratic Party, and they need a stopgap, and they're willing to try this, at least the center of its party, to join Republicans and try to put a hole or fill the gap that's in the border strategy right now. This would give significantly more leverage for the president, regardless who the president is, to be able to stop border incursions, the likes of which have gone up 7 times over the last 4 years.
Well, but let's talk about the president, Jeannie, because with everything Joe just outlined, the counter you hear from many Republicans is that these authorities that the president says he is getting, he actually already has, and he has just made the decision to not be using them right now. To what extent is that true? If this is dead in the House at least, and maybe possibly in the Senate as well, should Biden be using the pen in another way?
Yeah, these are the very same people who, when Barack Obama used the pen, threatened to impeach him over it because they claimed it was so unconstitutional. And, you know, my, how things have changed. This really is a battle over who's going to focus on the content and who's going to focus on the politics. And I have to say, my guess is politics probably went out in an election year, but that is such a mistake for Republicans because, mark my words, they will never have it so good. This deal is almost everything they could have wanted when they control just 1/3 of the federal government. And I suspect if this bill goes down, you will see Joe Biden, he should go right to that border and say, listen, I was willing to do this and get past the toughest bill, and they took it from me because Donald Trump doesn't want a loss on this. And that's something you'll hear Democrats say over and over if this goes down.
We've got 30 seconds, Rick. Is that good politics? Joe Biden makes a beeline for the border now.
Well, he's losing badly to Donald Trump on that issue, and that issue is now number one in most of the 7 key targeted states for this election. So he's got to do something quick.
Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our signature panel here on the Monday edition of Balance of Power. Thank you both for walking us through these important issues. Kaylee, this is not coming easily, although I think to Rick's point, we need to give this a couple of days to breathe.
Well, sure, see if anyone changes their tune. But when you have a long list of people already lining up to say they are hard-nosed, how do they back themselves out of that corner?
I have no idea. I won't ask you how we're going to fund the government next month either. Let's get to world and national news right now. Nancy Lyons will help us from the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Hey, Joe. Buckingham Palace says King Charles III has been diagnosed with a form of cancer and has begun treatment. In a statement, the palace says this cancer is not related to the king's recent treatment for a benign prostate condition, but they did not say what form of cancer the 75-year-old monarch does have. Israel says it has destroyed 17 of Hamas's 24 battalions, but says the fight in Gaza is not over, and there are growing concerns Israel may be pulled into another war with Hezbollah. Israel spokesman Elan Levy says skirmishes with Hezbollah continue along Israel's northern border, and the U.S. is expressing concern.
Defense Minister Yoav Gallant met last night with senior U.S. presidential advisor Amos Hochstein. He reiterated Israel's desire to resolve this crisis by diplomatic means and underscored Israel's preparedness for other scenarios.
Israeli spokesman Elan Levy. Hezbollah is the most powerful militia in the Middle East. Israel estimates it has an arsenal of more than 100,000 rockets and missiles. 8 Southern California counties are under a state of emergency with the risk of flooding and high winds from a second atmospheric river in less than a week. The National Weather Service called yesterday, quote, one of the most dramatic weather days in recent memory for Southern California. And a Michigan jury is deliberating whether to hold a high school student's mother partially responsible for the killing of 4 students in 2021. Jennifer Crumbly faces charges of involuntary manslaughter for allowing her son to own a gun. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We've got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 Index, Russell 2000, all trading lower right now. Back to work Monday, and the S&P down 35, drop there of 0.2%. Traders sending both stocks and bonds lower, following stronger than expected economic data and signals that the Fed is not ready to call victory over inflation just yet. S&P, as I mentioned, down 0.2%. The Dow lower by 0.3%, down 13 points. NASDAQ down 37, a decline right now of 0.2%. We've got the 10-year yielding 4.15%, with the 2-year that's yielding 4.45%. Spot gold down $14 the ounce to $20.25, a decline of 0.7%, while West Texas Intermediate crude now at $73.16 a barrel, up by 1.2%. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan has launched an investigation into the accounting practices of Archer Daniels Midland. This, according to sources, ADM shares down by 4%. And McDonald's sales missed investor expectations in the fourth quarter as growth decelerated, hurt in part by the conflict in the Middle East. McDonald's down 3.8%, rivals Wendy's down 1%. QSR, Restaurant Brands International, which is the parent of Burger King, down now by 1.9%. Recapping stocks lower, S&P now down 43 points. That is a decline of 0.3%. I'm Charlie Pellet. Balance of Power continues. Once again, here's Kaylee Lyons and Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet with a look at what's happening in the markets up in New York. Thank you so much. Welcome back indeed to Balance of Power on both Bloomberg Television and radio. Here in Washington, we've talked at length, Joe, about the politics around the border deal, the text of which was just released yesterday. Politics really defines the name of the game right now, less so the actual policy. You were running through it just a moment ago, the changes to asylum and parole authorities, the sheer number that would be allowed in before President Biden would have to use the authority to shut things down. There is real policy substance here. It's just a question of how much that actually matters.
I'm just wondering how many people are getting to the point of reading it, because minds seemed to be made up last week based on leaks and Facebook reports, social media, Trump tweets, because these were considered out of reach for Republicans until very recent history, Kaylee, and it looks like they might let it go.
Well, dead on arrival in the House. That's what we're hearing from House leadership. So maybe you just don't even catch it in the first place. You just don't touch it at all, less so letting go. But the fact of the matter remains, the policy we're talking about is about what happens when people arrive here, when they're actually at the border, whether they're let in, whether they're granted asylum, what happens in the United States. There's also the really important question about why the people are arriving here in the first place, where they're coming from. And so for more on this conversation, we want to bring in now Maria Fernanda Bosmosky. She's Deputy Director of the Adrian Ash Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. Maria, thank you so much for being with us. As we consider what is primarily a border measure, not necessarily immigration policy changes as a whole here, are these policy initiatives doing enough to address the actual root cause of why we have a border issue in the first place?
Thank you so much for having me. And I think that that's a great question to kick off the conversation. Very few things are being done from a policy perspective to address what is pushing thousands of people to the U.S.-Mexico border every single day. I think that you'll hear in the halls of Washington, D.C., that, there's a crisis at the border. And I don't disagree with that. There's certainly a security, humanitarian, economic crisis, but it doesn't start at the U.S. border. It starts 3,000 miles south. We're seeing a huge security crisis in Latin America. Weeks ago, we saw in Ecuador on live TV just anchors being held at gunpoint. And we're seeing that across Latin America. The whole security situation is deteriorating in the countries. And that is one of the top 3 reasons that migrants cite as the reasons that are pushing them out of their countries.
Well, among the provisions in this deal includes something that Republicans have been asking for some time: new expedited removal authority for migrants who do not qualify for asylum. And that definition of asylum, as we've been discussing, is being tightened. We heard from one of the negotiators, Kirsten Sinema, that they will be sent back home. What happens when they get there?
One of the things that this bill, as I was looking through it, that I think is worth pointing out in relation to your question, Joe, is that there's at least $4 billion that would be allocated to the Department of State. That would be roughly divided into 50% of that would be to help build capacity in the countries to accept and reintegrate individuals that have been removed from the United States. I think that that is essential. I think that the countries in Latin America really need that kind of support. And then the other half of those $400 million, is going to be, if this bill were to pass, allocated to address some of those root causes that are pushing Latin Americans, lots of Central Americans, to come to the U.S. border.
Yeah, if it were to pass is a good point to make, as it looks right now that this bill will not, in fact, be passing. But when it comes to asylum specifically, something else you hear from specifically Republicans who have pushed back against having too expansive asylum allowances here in the U.S. is that these migrants should be applying for asylum in the other countries through which they're passing. Just with your knowledge of Latin America, how difficult is it to attain real asylum in these other countries that are not the United States?
I think, unfortunately, the infrastructure throughout Latin America for seeking asylum is not very robust. For example, in Costa Rica, after 2018, when there were huge crises and manifestations in Nicaragua, the system was very quickly overwhelmed. And Costa Rica is arguably one of the most well-equipped countries in the region to support asylees and applications. The other thing to note is that these migrants, many times when you talk to them, you realize that leaving their countries is their last resort. They want to leave their homes, but they're being threatened, they're being extorted, they don't have economic opportunities. And so going back to the previous question, I think that this bill, again, if it were to pass, would maybe potentially be a game changer if it could help address some of those key factors that are at the border.
Here, or for that matter, any undocumented immigrants already living in the country, should there be?
To address a system that is broken, that you can say that from, I think, any point in this country. And I think that this is kind of low-hanging fruit. We can't deny this is a political year, of course. It's also, elections are happening in Mexico this year too. So I think that that's an interesting dynamic that is shaping some of the substance that is in this bill.
And finally, as we talk about the idea that this bill may not shut down the border entirely, if the U.S. were to do that, Maria, what would that realistically look like? What happens on the other side of the border?
Well, the U.S. President López Obrador in Mexico has in the past been willing to work, especially with former President Trump, on receiving individuals who have been removed. It's an election year. The candidate for the opposing party, Xochitl Gálvez, is in D.C. today, and politics in the immigration in the U.S.-Mexico relationship is like it's a tricky thing, and I don't know how the president might receive this request.
Maria, thank you for joining us. It's great analysis in the hours following the release of this text. We appreciate your insights here from your perch at the Atlantic Council. Maria, Fernanda, Bosmosky, Kaylee, there's going to be a lot more time to decipher this, but we're getting some interesting reactions here today already.
Although, to her point, we're talking about what happens if the bill passes.
That's right.
That is still a massive if, is the reality here in Washington today.
Looks like